Let's talk about the VAK. Now, the VAK means visual, auditory, kinesthetic. This is something from NLP, which stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Neuro-Linguistic Programming is a body of knowledge created a while back in the 70s by two gentlemen, Richard Bandler and John Grinder. And we always give credit where credit is due. These men took a lot of information and put it together and created this body of knowledge, which is really about assigning new meanings to things. For example, if someone has the idea that money equals pain because rich people are put down all the time. Well, NLP can come along, an NLP practitioner can help you overcome that because they can teach you through a series of NLP techniques that money actually equals freedom, reassigning the meaning of things, the association that you have. But NLP is so much more than that. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. That's just an introduction to NLP. If you want to study more, I encourage you to do that. But right now we're going to look at part of it, which is VAK, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And that means that we all relate to the universe around us primarily with one of these three ways of dealing with the world. Either we're visual, or auditory, or we're kinesthetic. Either we're tuned into what we see, and we describe things in terms of what we see, or we're auditory, we describe things in terms of what we hear, or we're kinesthetic, we describe things in terms of what we feel and how things feel to us, like a car might be described as the feeling of being behind the wheel and the rush that you get and the feeling of the leather as you sit on it and so forth. Visual people relate to their world in a visual way, and they usually talk in visual terms. I see your point. I see what you mean. I see myself in that car. I see myself in the future doing this or that. Visual people are the majority of people out there, approximately 70 or 80%, something very high. A lot of people are visual. Visual people, when we talk about them, it doesn't mean that they only relate to the world in terms of visual things, because they usually have ears also, and they can also feel things. It just means that primarily they relate to the world in a visual way. So, 70 or 80% of the people out there relate to the world in a visual way. And when they do, that means that we should talk with them in a visual way. We should talk with them in a way that has to do with things that can be seen. For example, when you're talking to a visual person, you would say words such as look, or see, or imagine. When you're talking with a visual person, realize that they primarily relate to their universe in terms of what they see. So if you're talking a different language, if you're talking the language of hearing or the language of feeling things, then you're going to lose them. It's not that they can't relate to those things. It's just that they usually don't relate to those things as much as they relate to visual things. Things they can see, things they can imagine with their mind's eye. So, when you want them to see the possibilities for change, you need to talk to them in terms of looking toward the future and seeing themselves in that new office, or seeing themselves with that car, or seeing themselves with that job. They need to be able to look at something in their minds. So for these people, it's great if you can have something for them to look at. If they want to get a new car, perhaps you can cut out the picture of the car from a magazine and have them put it on their refrigerator. That's a great idea for people who are visual. They will be able to see it. They will be able to relate to it. They will be able to understand it. It makes sense to their brains because they're primarily visual, and they will be able to move forward and get it. So creating vision boards is great for these people. John Assaraf, one of the people who is in the movie The Secret, he creates vision boards for himself when he wants to get something. He wants to have a new car. He creates a vision board and puts the car on there. He's done this for a long time. He says he's done this since the 1980s. So this is something that's worked for him for a long time, and it will work for you. It's something that you can take advantage of if you are primarily visual. And also, more importantly, your client can take advantage of. If they want to get a new car, how about putting a picture of it somewhere where they can see it? How about putting a picture of it in several places where they're going to see it? And I'm talking about a prominent place, like the mirror that they look into when they're getting up in the morning, or the dashboard of their car, of their current car, or their desk at their office, someplace where they're going to see it loudly and clearly. They're going to see it right in front of them. Of course, loudly would have to do with an auditory person, by the way. But they're going to see it crisp and clear and vividly. They're going to see what they're focusing on. So, if you have a visual person, remember that you need to talk their language and have visual things available for them to look at. What about an auditory person? An auditory person is someone who primarily relates to their world in terms of sound, in terms of what they can hear. So they'll possibly be very much into music. Now, if they're into music, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're an auditory person just because they're into music. You can be into music and be a kinesthetic person or be a visual person, because most people have all of the senses available to them. It's just that primarily they lean toward one. So just because they're into music does not make them an auditory person. Just because they like to listen to speeches or hear themselves talk or hear you talk doesn't make them an auditory person. You're going to discover this over time. You're going to, hopefully within the first few meetings, discover which way they primarily relate to things. The best way to do this is to have them talk about an experience. Let's say they went on vacation recently. Ask them to talk about that. And when they talk about that, you're going to find out how they describe it. If they're talking about the sound of the ocean and how the sales pitch when they heard about the vacation rental sounded good to them, and how they heard about it from a friend and so forth, then you're going to be hearing a lot of auditory cues in their conversation that are going to tip you off and let you know that you're dealing with an auditory person. So you want to pay careful attention to the way they describe things. And you don't necessarily have to get them talking about a vacation in order to get this information from them. Sometimes you can just have them talk in general. Sometimes people's normal conversation that they have will reveal everything that you need to know. And when it is revealed, you need to take note of it. You need to pay attention to it. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have a sheet of paper tallying up every time. Oh, that was an auditory reference. That was a visual reference. Oh, that was a kinesthetic reference. What it does mean is that you're keeping count somehow. You're keeping a record of it somehow in your mind. Sometimes it will be very obvious. Sometimes when someone's relating to a representational system, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic primarily, it's going to be very obvious because almost everything they say is going to be about that. In the example of auditory, everything they say is going to be about sound. It sounded good. I heard this from a friend. I'm going to go listen to some music later. Everything's auditory, 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 and it's very easy. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. Sometimes there won't be a primary one. Sometimes they relate to all of them, and they are just multifaceted, and that's okay. Then you can use any of them as you talk to them. But listen for what they're saying. So an example of auditory would be if they say things like, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're trying to get at here. So if they say the word hear, as in I hear what you're saying, then you know that they are auditory. Actually, you don't know that they're primarily auditory. You know that they're at least partially auditory. If they're consistently talking about hearing more than anything else, more than anything visual or kinesthetic, then you know that they're primarily auditory. So listen for that. Also the word ring. They'll say, oh, that had a familiar ring to me. Or that rings true for me. You see, there are a lot of ways to say that sounds true or that is true for me. I can say I see your point. I can say I feel what you're saying is true. Or I can say something along the lines of that rings true for me. In each of those instances, I was using a different system to represent what I feel. I was using a different primary representational system to represent what I feel. In one case, it was kinesthetic. In one case, it was visual. In one case, it was auditory. So you need to listen to how they're saying things. We're going to talk about kinesthetic next, so you'll understand that more thoroughly. But for now, realize that auditory people will say things like, sounds good. That sounds good. You'll say something to them and they'll say, that sounds good. You'll say the next thing to them, they'll say, that sounds good. Well, don't just take that for granted. You may think that's just a figure of speech. Well, everybody says sounds good every now and then, don't they? I mean, it does sound good. But they chose to say it like that. And you've got to ask yourself why. Why did they choose to say it like that? It's because they relate to sound. It sounds good. They chose those words. So rather than taking words for granted, rather than just thinking that your client is throwing out a number of cliches that sound good, I want you to realize that what really sounds good is the idea that you're going to be able to get a lot of information from the way they talk about things. If you just start paying attention to what they're already saying, remember, you don't have to engage them in a conversation about their vacation if you don't want to, or if it's inappropriate, or if it would seem like it's wasting their time. After all, they're paying for your time. You can listen to their normal conversation, what they're already putting out there, what they're already saying, and you can get all of the information that you need. So, hear, ring, sounds good, all of those things have to do with auditory. What about kinesthetic? Kinesthetic has to do with feeling and touching. It also has to do with movement. So kinesthetic is almost a catch-all. It has to do with the things that aren't auditory or visual. Now, there's also olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory, which is taste. These two senses are usually not going to be a primary way that people relate to their world. They're usually not going to go through their world experiencing it in terms of how everything tastes or how they think things might taste. That tastes good to me. That idea tastes good. You usually don't hear that. Sometimes people relate to smell primarily, but very rarely. That smells good, or oh, I smell a rat, or that idea really stinks. So if you hear that, go ahead and use it. But usually that won't happen. Those are very rare that someone will be primarily olfactory or gustatory. Olfactory meaning smell, gustatory meaning taste. However, it is possible. What is much more likely is that you'll have a kinesthetic person, a person who relates to feeling and touch. They feel what you're saying. You know that phrase, I feel you, man. I feel you. I feel what you're saying. Doesn't that sound kind of odd when you first hear it, or does it? If you're kinesthetic, it probably doesn't sound odd at all. If the person you're talking to is kinesthetic, they probably relate to that very strongly. To someone who's not kinesthetic, it really doesn't make much sense. What do you mean you feel what I'm saying, or you feel me? What does that even mean? What is that? What? If someone is not speaking someone's language, it can be very frustrating. It can make no sense. What you have to realize is that you have to speak your client's language. They don't have to speak your language. You have to speak their language. So you have to get into what they are all about. And what they are all about is speaking the language of their primary way of relating to the universe. Their primary way of relating to the universe is going to be one of these three things. So kinesthetic people are all about touching and shaking hands and the way their clothes feel on their body and so forth. They really want to get into the way life feels, and they'll describe a bike ride in terms of the wind blowing on their hair and how that felt, and the speed that they were going and how their legs were moving, rather than what they saw, the ocean nearby, or what they heard, the birds. They'll talk about the way things felt. So if you hear that, no matter what you may think about the way they represent their world, you need to start talking that way if you want to talk their language. Now, kinesthetic can carry with it a lot of different words, a lot of key words that you can look for. such as feel and touch. But it's not limited to that. People who are kinesthetic will talk about the way things feel, and they'll talk about touch, but they'll also use a lot of other words that have to do with describing those things. So I want you to get accustomed to paying attention to things that sound like they have to do with feeling something like clothes or touching something. For example, a kinesthetic person might say, well, the temperature of the meeting just wasn't right. It just felt a little hot in there. I was getting a little hot under my collar. Or so-and-so walked in and there was just a chill in the room. You're talking with someone, in that case, who at least relates to being kinesthetic. They may not be primarily kinesthetic. You'll have to listen more and gather more data, more evidence, if you will, to prove your case that they're kinesthetic primarily. But they at least are talking that language at that time. People who are kinesthetic are going to constantly talk about things in terms of touching and feeling, just like a visual person would talk about what they can see, and an auditory person would talk about what they can hear. A kinesthetic person is going to consistently talk about what they can touch and what they can feel, and if they can get in touch with you later. You see, I can say, I'll get in touch with you later, but why would I say that? You may think, well, that's just what people say. You may think, again, that's just a cliche, that's just a phrase people use, that's what they say. But I could have said anything. I could have said, I will call you later. I could have said, you will hear from me later. I could have said, I'll see you later. Sometimes people say that, even when they're not going to see you later. When they're on the phone with you and they're primarily visual, and they're several states or countries away, they'll say, I'll see you later. Even if they won't actually see you, that just means that they're going to talk to you later. That just means they'll be in touch later. That's their way of saying it, their visual way of saying it. So listen to how they talk. They're going to give it away all the time. They're going to give themselves away. They're going to reveal their cards. They're going to show the way they relate to the world. Now, you're not trying to pick up on this so you can manipulate your client. That's not what this is all about. What this is about is talking their language. If you're not talking their language, V, A, or K, you may as well be talking Chinese to someone who speaks English or Portuguese to someone who speaks Chinese. It's really just not going to work out. You need to make sure you talk their language. So pay attention and get into the V, A, or K of your client.